So Matt, your turn.
Okay, well, maybe we can get started then. So my name is Matt Hollander. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Marion Technical College in Marion, Ohio. And my co-author and I, Jason Turowetz, have authored a book which is forthcoming from Oxford, and it is called Morality in the Making of Sense and Self: Stanley Milgram's Obedience Experiments in the New Science of Morality. And this is a conference on social psychology and the Holocaust. It's been recognized for a very long time that Milgram has something to say, I suppose, about the Holocaust. That was very much in the forefront of his mind. But of course, the debate for decades is exactly what is that connection? What possible connection could there be between Milgram's famous experiments on obedience to authority in 1961, 1962, and the Holocaust? A very different kind of event, obviously, from what took place in his lab for 30 to 60 minutes over a 9-month period in the early 60s, as compared to the Holocaust in Europe between 1933 and 1965. So our book attempts to address that, that very large question. And so I think it's perfectly appropriate for a discussion of this kind of book on Milgram, taking a very close look at social interaction in the Milgram experiment in the context of this kind of conference on social psychology and the Holocaust. I think it's safe to say, based on what people have said in their introductions, that everyone is just fascinated by the Milgram experiment. Everyone, of course, has a very deep and abiding concern and interest in the Holocaust and other examples of genocide in the 20th century, but also a fascination with the Milgram experiment. I was at a dinner party last night. My wife and I are here in Virginia. We're actually on vacation in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we were visiting friends in Richmond. And we were at their house last night, and I think my friend mentioned that she had heard that Jason and I were publishing a book on Milgram, and immediately she and her husband started talking about the Milgram experiment. I didn't have to pressure them to talk about Milgram at all. They're somewhat educated. They're highly educated. Her husband is a high school math teacher, and she's a professor in sociology at the University of Virginia. But neither of them is a specialist in any sort of way on social psychology or on Milgram. But they had a lot to say. And it was just sort of, last night was just sort of a reminder to me about how fascinating the Milgram experiment has been for so many people. We're still talking about this classic experiment in North American social psychology some 60 years after it was performed. And again, the question for us is why? Why does it have such abiding interest and seeming relevance for so many of us around the world? So as Raphael, you said, I'd like to spend some time talking about our book. I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociologist of language and social interaction. My background is in empirical social science, and specifically the detailed study of language and social interaction. People who do what I do make video and audio recordings of everyday and institutional interactions. Everyday interactions, for example, in a family kind of a setting, or a restaurant kind of a setting, or institutional interactions in, for example, Milgram's lab in the early 60s, in the halls of government, in educational settings, in economic settings, et cetera. We've taken that background and training in the detailed empirical study of language and social interaction and applied it to a large collection of audio recordings of Milgram's experiment. The starting point for this research was really in my dissertation. I was in graduate school for a very long time at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I remember sitting in a social psychology class with the sociologist Doug Maynard. And I remember we were talking about classic experiments in North American social psychology, experiments such as Milgram, Solomon Asch, Stanley Schachter, experiments like that. And I remember Doug mentioning at one point, this was around 2010, that it would be so interesting to take a close look at social interaction in some of these classic experiments. I know the sociologist John Ray in Britain has had an inviting interest with Solomon Asch, the famous line experiment from the mid-50s, and our work on Milgram is in the same kind of vein. So for me, that moment in Doug's class was sort of an aha moment. After the class, I went up to Doug and I said, yes, that's what I would like to do. I would like to do that for my dissertation. And that's what I did. I got a grant. And working with the archive at Yale University on Milgram, I was able to get copies of 117 recordings of the Milgram experiment. These are recordings which cover 5 different conditions of Milgram's experiment. The Milgram lists, the archive lists 24 conditions in total. Recent research has found that really in only 23 of these conditions did Milgram actually manipulate an independent variable. So there were 23 experimental conditions, and we have a fair amount of interactional data on 5 of those conditions. Okay, well, I'd like to start then. Let's see, I wrote down some notes. I'd like to present our book. Really, the book is about Milgram and morality. And again, just going back to what people said in their introductions, this is an amazing kind of context for talk about the kind of book which we wrote. It's very interesting that people are here from different disciplines, from philosophy, from neuroscience, from history, from sociology, etc. That's precisely the kind of audience that Jason and I were thinking about and hoping that our book can reach. Overall, in trying to make a connection between Milgram and morality, we're hoping to spark exactly this kind of interdisciplinary discussion about what each one of those 2 areas can learn from each other. What we found from our involvement in both literatures, in the literature, especially the sociology of morality on the one hand, and the literature on Milgram, is that a lot of people on both sides have a lot of interest in the other. A lot of scholars of Milgram have a lot of interest in morality and have written some things about the relevance of morality in Milgram's lab. And on the other hand, scholars of morality have had an abiding interest with Milgram. What we found in our reviews of the literature is that that interest has not been very extensive. Milgram scholars who write something about morality typically don't take into account the explosion of research in morality in a wide variety of fields in neuroscience and philosophy and sociology, etc., that has taken place in recent decades, maybe especially since the turn of the 21st century. Conversely, scholars of morality, they may have a lot of interest in Milgram, but are not necessarily very deeply aware of, especially the new wave, the second wave, as it's been called, of Milgram research, which has happened in the last 20 years or so. And so again, the overall purpose of our book is to put those 2 areas of interest and literature into dialogue with each other. We've tried to take our embeddedness in the literature on Milgram and bring our concern with the sociology of morality into dialogue with each other. And that's really what chapter 1 of our book is doing in our lit review. We focus on, in particular, the new sociology of morality. And we try to position the approach that we take in the book to spark that kind of dialogue with the sociology of morality. Just before saying a little bit about the substantive focus of our book, I'd like to say a little bit about our theoretical orientation. I mentioned before that I'm a sociologist of language and social interaction. I think for some of you, that might be more familiar than for others. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we use as data naturally occurring social interaction in a wide varieties of everyday and institutional life, with the Milgram experiment and the audio recordings that we have of the Milgram experiment being an example of social interaction in an institutional kind of a setting. And for decades, scholars in especially ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, which is an interdisciplinary field but has its origins in sociology, and also discursive psychology, which is largely housed in psychology departments. For many years, scholars of that background have pursued this kind of analysis. It's an approach to empirical social science, which has affinities with Wittgenstein's approach to forms of life and better understanding the way that our everyday practices, especially our practices of language games, in some important sense form the bedrock of our attempts, for example, to do science, to do mathematics. The foundation of science and mathematics perhaps has a lot to do with cultural practices for making sense together, practices which are everyday and which are learned through primary socialization with caregivers. So there's a lot of, in short, philosophical relevance to this approach to doing empirical social science in sociology and also in psychology. With that approach, we're looking at a large collection of Milgram's audio recordings and focusing in this book on a particular concrete practice. Words like morality are very big and hazy. It's a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Morality, concepts like power, obviously very important in all these fields, history and philosophy and social science. And what scholars like I try to do is to respecify large concepts, large multi-dimensional concepts like morality perhaps or power into members of society's concrete, witnessable practices. So in short, participants in Milgram's experiment display an orientation to resistance as being relevant at certain parts of the interaction. So Milgram's experimental teachers, his naive subjects, they're participating in the experiment. They are pursuing experimental continuation, which is the course of action which the authority figure of the experiment has directed them to pursue. They're reading word pair lists to the Confederate learner. They're shocking him when he gets the answer wrong. They're going up the shock, the fake shock machine, etc. They're pursuing experimental continuation, but then they'll turn around at some point after delivering a shock to the learner, what they think is an actual electroshock. They'll turn to the experimenter and say something like, "He screamed." And then they'll fall silent for a few seconds. And the experimenter will say something like, "Yes, please continue," which is one, of course, of his experimental prods, his scripted prods that he's using to further pressure the teacher to continue with the experiment. We take practices like that, "he screamed," or falling silent immediately after the teacher, the experimenter directs them to continue, or laughing as they sigh, displaying the effort of continuing without thereby going on, or refusing explicitly to go on, or displaying their unwillingness or their inability to go on. We take all that variety of practices, which is apparent in our recordings of the Milgram experiment, to perform the practice of resistance. Resistance, in short, is our focal interactional phenomenon. We're not studying resistance simply as something that the teachers do, but as they do in interaction. We're looking at resistance as situated moral practice, as we define it in the book, in the context of Milgram's lab. And interestingly, we find that it's not just disobedient outcome participants who perform resistance. We know that some of Milgram's participants ended the experiment in the way that Milgram operationalized his two outcome groups as disobedient or defiant. They performed resistance. They turned to the experimenter and said, "He screamed," or they'll shout to the learner in the next room, "Are you okay in there?" And they'll wait to hear what he says, or they'll say, "I just can't do this anymore." And when the experimenter says, "Please continue," or "You have no choice, you have to continue, the experiment requires to continue," they'll sustain their resistance and issue another refusal to go on. And that assertive form of linking together a variety of forms of resistance, sustaining resistance, is part of what accounts for their ability to defy the experimenter, to achieve, to accomplish Milgram's outcome category of disobedience. It's not just them, however. We find in close examination of the recordings who perform resistance, we find that virtually all participants in Milgram's experiment perform at least minimal resistance. And that, I think, is a very important and interesting finding. It points to a lot of commonality in the way that all participants in Milgram's lab performed in that setting. Virtually all participants resisted, at least minimally, the experimenter's directive to begin the experiment, to continue the experiment. And yet only some of those resistors use a sufficiently wide variety of forms of resistance, or sustain that resistance, or were sufficiently assertive in that kind of resistance to achieve Milgram's outcome category disobedience. If participants resisted, but then backed down, if they said, I just can't do this anymore, but when the experimenter said, the experiment really requires you to go on, please continue, teacher, if they backed down and resumed continuation of the experiment, they ended the experiment obediently, despite that momentary, that temporary displaying of situated moral practice in the experiment. Some participants were successful, more successful than others in resisting the experiment. And in looking at the how of resistance, the detailed mechanics of how participants resisted, we argue that that kind of study can hopefully go a long way towards better understanding important why questions. We're all very interested, of course, in why the obedient outcome participants did what they did, but we're not necessarily too aware of exactly what they did in its detail in the experiment. How did disobedient outcome participants distinguish themselves from obedient outcome participants in their use of resistance? And that's a large part of our empirical study in the book. So all that is goes, I think, a long way towards sort of explaining our theoretical approach using ethnomethodology and conversation analysis to study detailed social interaction in Milgram's lab. And I think at this point, maybe I could go on and talk a little bit about our substantive chapters in the book, and then sum up with the conclusions that we draw in the book. I'd be happy, by the way, at this point, to take any questions or comments if people think that this might be a good point to make a remark or ask a question. On the other hand, I'd be happy to hear the kinds of remarks that Paul, you were talking about after I finish, or hear any questions after I finish. So are there any questions or remarks that people have right now? Okay, so I'll just go on to talk a little bit about the organization of the book, our substantive chapters in the book, and then sum up with our conclusions, and that'll be a presentation of our book. We divide the book into three parts. We have an introduction, which introduces our data, which introduces our theoretical approach, ethnomethodology and conversation analysis in part one of the book. Part two of the book focuses on detailed social interaction in the experiments themselves. So we've spent, I suppose, many years now, since roughly 2010, 2011, or at least I did before I invited Jason to join me on this project around 2017, spending a lot of time, many hours with the details of these recordings. I've spent many hours listening to interaction in the Milgram experiment. And that has to do with interaction in the experiment itself, when participants are actually shocking the learner or actually resisting the experimenter's directives to go on. And then I've also spent a lot of time listening and making notes and coding and writing papers about interaction in the immediately post-experiment debriefing interview. And that is what those audio recordings in Yale's Milgram archive contain. They contain everything from when the teacher enters the Milgram's lab, or even a few minutes before that, to when the teacher subject leaves after being debriefed. The second part of the book then focuses on interaction in the experiment itself. And then the third and final part of the book focuses on interaction in the immediately post-experiment debriefing. In the experiment itself, we, in chapter 3, examine resistance. We introduce resistance and define it, and then talk about the way in which resistance, in the way that we're studying it, is embedded in local talk and interaction among three parties: the teacher, the learner, and the experimenter. And we perform sequential analysis using a number of transcribed extracts from the Milgram experiment to illustrate these local contexts, these local sequentially organized contexts of talk and interaction. So when the teacher, for example, is performing the experiment, the teacher is performing what we call a teaching sequence, which the experimenter has instructed them in before beginning the experiment. And that involves what we're all familiar with, reading the learner the list of word pairs, telling him the right answer. If he gets them wrong, delivering a shock, reading the correct answer, moving on to the next list of word pairs, or if he gets the answer right, moving on to the next word pair in the list. It's sequentially organized. It's a phenomenon of talk and interaction. Similarly, when the experimenter treats the teacher as resistive and says, the experiment requires you to go on, please continue, that directive, as we all recognize, is something that happens in ordinary social life as well as in other features of institutions, in the classroom or in the boardroom or what have you. People issue directives or commands to other people, and that social action of issuing a directive projects as a relevant next action prompt compliance. It's not actually what people always do, and there's a wide variety of ways, of course, that people respond to directives, but the directive itself projects a certain kind of second pair part to that initial first pair part in that sequence of social action. A directive projects a prompt compliance, a prompt answer which complies with the directive. In a similar way, when the learner complains, when the learner shouts out from the adjacent room, experimenter, get me out of here. I can't take this anymore. I have a heart condition. Please, please stop. The learner, rather, is complaining. The learner is demanding that a remedy to his situation be supplied. And we all know that complaints, of course, happen in a wide variety of social settings. Complaints, in a way similar or analogous to directives, are also first pair parts. They project a certain kind of response, which is prompt remedy. If you complain, the social action which is projected there is immediately supplying a remedy to the source of that complaint, even though, of course, just as with directives, there's a wide variety of ways that we actually, in actual social interaction, respond to remedies. So it's against this background, it's in this local, sequentially organized context of directive response sequences and complaint remedy sequences that resistance emerges as a phenomenon of talk and interaction in the Milgram experiment. That's our conversation analytic or discursive psychological way of analyzing interaction in the Milgram experiment. And chapter 3, as well as the remainder of part 2 of the book, focusing on interaction in the experiment itself, focuses on our findings regarding resistance. We define resistance as action performed by the teacher, but also the learner, which temporarily postpones or delays immediate experimental continuation, orienting to the learner's complaints as the reason for that delay, the reason for that postponement of immediate experimental continuation. Resistance also can project discontinuation of the experiment. In chapter 4 of the book, we identify 6 forms of resistance, a small number of ways of resisting that both obedient outcome and disobedient outcome participants mobilize in these recordings. It's fascinating that both disobedient and obedient outcome participants use the same small number of forms of resistance. And we present those forms of resistance in a continuum way, ranging from implicit forms of resistance to relatively explicit forms of resistance. So ranging from, for example, when the experimenter tells you, please continue, go on, the experiment requires you to go on. If you don't immediately go on, if you postpone immediate continuation simply by remaining silent or simply by hesitating, that is a relatively implicit form of resistance. We call it silence and hesitation. And on the other end of the spectrum, if when the experimenter directs you to go on, you say, I refuse to go on, even very rarely, if you say, I refuse to go on moral grounds because this is wrong, and virtually no participants in our collection actually say that, but they do say, I refuse to go on, or I can't do this anymore to them. I just can't do this anymore. I'm unwilling to go on. That is a form of resistance which doesn't merely postpone immediate continuation, but which actively projects discontinuation of the experiment as a relevant next action. I refuse to go on, prompting the experimenter to do something, to remedy the learner's situation and indeed to end the experiment. So that's part 2 of the book. In the last part of the book, part 3 of the book, we focus on social interaction in the immediately post-experiment debriefing interviews. We find that there are 2 kinds of debriefing which Milgram performed or had his Confederate experimenter perform, John Williams, who was the amateur actor and high school biology teacher who performed the role of the experimenter in Milgram's lab. In many experimental conditions, the experimenter performs what we call partial debriefing or deceptive debriefing, where some aspects of what Milgram is looking at in the experiment are revealed to the teacher, but the teacher never is told that the learner never actually received electroshocks. Starting with condition 20, which was the condition which had women as opposed to men play the role of the experimental participants, Milgram has a more extensive what we call full debriefing. In that form of debriefing, the experimenter does explain to the participant that the learner was not actually receiving shocks and spends a fair amount of time with the teacher. And Milgram's reason for that was he felt that women in that condition, condition 20, he needed to ensure that they didn't leave the lab in a panicked state. He was orienting to the difference in gender there as the reason for changing from partial debriefing towards full debriefing. And in fact, we find that in recordings of later conditions 23 and 24, he continues with the full debriefing style rather than revert to the partial incomplete form of debriefing that he had done in earlier experimental conditions. In chapter 6, which starts part 3 of the book, we focus on attempts to explain. Let's say I might be frozen there. Am I frozen or can you hear me?
You're not frozen, but there is something weird going on because okay, no, it's okay.
Okay, looks normal now. Okay, so in chapter 6, we focus on attempts in the recent Milgram literature, the Milgram Renaissance, or the second wave of Milgram studies of the past 20 years or so, to explain Milgram-esque obedience. We focus especially on engaged followership, which is an explanation for obedience to authority that has been proposed by the social psychologists Alice Haslam and Stephen Riker, and then also on rhetorical persuasion, which is a proposal that has been argued for by the psychologist Stephen Gibson in Britain. In chapter 6, we contrast those explanations with our own attempt to explain obedience or account for obedience, which we call doing being ordinary, which I can briefly present as being responsive to the way that so many participants in our data, so many obedient participants, account for their resistance, both in the experiment itself and in the post-experiment debriefing interviews, with statements along the lines of, you know what, I could hear him screaming in the other room, but I thought it was going to be okay. It doesn't seem very logical after the fact, but it's amazing how many people say some version of the learner was not really being harmed. It seems counterintuitive to us after the fact, observing these recordings of Milgram's experiment some 60 years after the experiment itself, but many participants accounted for their resistance, accounted for their obedience in terms of statements on the line of they didn't think that the learner was really being harmed. It's a different context of accountability, the post-experiment interview as opposed to the experiment itself. What they're doing there may very well be self-defensive, may very well be accounting for their obedience. It's hard to say, but what we do find is that many participants do say something along the lines of the learner was not really being harmed. In chapter 7 of the book, we talk about the debriefing interview itself. We look at the way that it's sequentially organized. We have a paper on that from 2018 in Social Psychology Quarterly. And that chapter develops that paper looking at the way that debriefing was performed in the post-experiment interviews. Okay, so that's a lot of talk, perhaps too much talk about the substantive chapters in our book. And I can just wrap up pretty briefly with the statement of the conclusions in our book. Let's see, I wrote some notes here. Maybe I can just report to you 3 conclusions that we sum up with in the last chapter, chapter 8 of the book. Okay, I mentioned at the very beginning that of course, we're all interested in a conference on social psychology and the Holocaust in further unpacking and further developing thought about Milgram's potential relevance to the Holocaust, to genocide. What we argue is that in line with recent research, it's pretty unclear. There's no direct generalization to make to events which were so different in nature, in time scale and scope, Milgram's lab on the one hand, and the Holocaust on the other. That's very much in line with the second wave of Milgram studies. We do, however, find that Milgram's lab has very important lessons for morality, for scholars of morality. It's a morally charged situation. It's a situation that participants, the teachers, by and large, we find treated as quite real. They were very nervous. They were very engaged. It was a high impact experiment, along with other classic experiments in American social psychology of the 50s and 60s. And we see that in the recordings. People thought that this was something that was very emotionally involved. What we find in general is that Milgram's lab has a lot to say about the pernicious effects of inequality in the interaction order, inequality in situations of social interaction. When you're involved in a situation of having interactional power over another person, it matters, obviously, in how you treat that kind of a situation. And the way that actual people reacted to that situation in Milgram's lab has lessons, we think, for a wide variety of Milgram-esque situations, or perhaps less Milgram-esque situations, but situations of some kind of resonance or relevance to interactions with authority in everyday social life. Moving on to our second conclusion from the book, we argue that we are making a contribution to the sociology of morality in our book. We are sociologists, Jason and myself. We say a lot in the book about the import, as we see it, of our theoretical orientation, ethnomethodology, and conversation analysis to other approaches to the study, the empirical study, the social scientific study of morality, especially in the sociology of morality. We find that many sociologists of morality pay insufficient attention to the way in which morality is a feature of social order in general. This tradition sociology that we're working within holds that social order, in some important sense, is a moral order. And this tradition in important ways dates back to Emile Durkheim, the great sociologist and anthropologist, who used the word moral so frequently in his discussions of social science and sociology and anthropology. In some sense, what we're doing right now is morally engaged. In some sense, we all have moral expectations about what we're doing right now. We care as a matter of everyday moral concern to present ourselves in the right kind of way in what we're doing right now. In short, morality is not just a feature of certain kinds of specific and special situations in our lives, but rather it's an important feature of all aspects of our life, whether it's interacting with ordinary routine objects, worldly objects like forks and spoons or refrigerators or telephones, using those objects in the right kind of way, in the way that we've been socialized to use them, or our interactions with each other, whether they're face-to-face or virtuous in this kind of setting. In some sense, morality is a deeply embedded part of social order per se. Sociologists of language and social interaction distinguish that morality of interaction with morality in interaction, where people like me explicitly invoke the relevance of morality. If I start to talk about how badly my hypothetical friend over there was behaving last night at the dinner party, and she said this, and I can't believe that she said that, and I'm complaining about her, I'm orienting to the relevance of some aspect of morality as a multidimensional phenomenon as relevant to our interaction here and now. I'm complaining to you about what that absent third party did last night, and I'm invoking the relevance of rights and wrongs. So morality of interaction versus morality in interaction. And we find that sociologists of morality, we argue, have paid insufficient attention to morality of interaction, focusing exclusively on morality in interaction. What exactly is the connection between moral order as social order on the one hand, and our empirical or philosophical or historical concerns with morality as a phenomenon, a scientific concern? That's a big question. We try to produce our own response or our own answer to that question in the book, but maybe that's an important sort of question that I can throw out there and that we could talk about in the minutes that ensue. I would love to hear people's takes on that, what exactly you see that connection as possibly involving. So that's my presentation of our book, Morality in the Making of Sense and Self. And thanks so much for listening. I'd be very interested, of course, in hearing comments and questions that everyone has, especially comments that people have thought about beforehand, for those perhaps especially who have had a chance to read the book, but really for everyone as well. Thank you.
So many thanks, Matt. So maybe there are very short questions about something that Matt said that is not redundant with your later presentation. You can ask it now. Anna, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. It was really fascinating. So I was just wondering, you mentioned the necessity of taking into account the moral philosophy in general. So I was just wondering, what's exactly a person like you trying to answer the questions you just asked, what exactly you're taking from moral philosophy? Maybe give us some names or ideas, some ideas, or maybe you don't need the theory coming from philosophy at all. I was just curious, how do you use our possible inputs?
That's a great question. We don't use philosophy per se really in the book. I did mention Wittgenstein when talking about the interaction order tradition, sociology, ethnomethodology, and conversation analysis. And perhaps this goes to the distinction that I was making before between morality of interaction on the one hand and morality in interaction. So when philosophers ranging from Aristotle to whoever talk about moral philosophy, when they talk about ethics, they're concerned with some sort of phenomenon in human life that is morality. And they're distinguishing that from other topics. When Aristotle talks about morality on the one hand or ethics, and then in another work talks about science in some sense, what we would call today psychology or natural science or something like that, he's talking about different areas of investigative concern. He's talking about different topics without really making without really arguing that morality is in some sense foundational to science. He's talking about morality, we might put it, in interaction, or morality as a particular specialized phenomenon in human life, as opposed to morality as an intrinsic part of social order. And that perhaps is something that is shared throughout the moral philosophical tradition. It's a huge gloss, it's a huge blanket statement, but it may be only in the last 100, 150 years that social scientists, philosophers have thought about what many scholars today call the moral background. That's the title of a book by the sociologist of morality Gabriel Abend from 2014, The Moral Background. And that derives, of course, from philosophers' more general concern in the 20th century to identify some sort of background of human life, some sort of background which, in some sense, grounds, which makes possible our activities in life, such as science. When, for example, the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl was trying to ground the activities of scientists in something which was certainly known in the abstract structures of consciousness. It's an attempt to provide a background for science. And students of Husserl, such as Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, have very influentially argued that background is important, but it's a very different kind of background, or Wittgenstein, it's a very different kind of background than the kind of background that Kant or Husserl had in mind. And when we drill down far enough in Wittgenstein's image of pushing that spade down into the earth, trying to find the foundations of mathematics, or trying to find the foundations of natural science, what we find is not something, perhaps, that can be certainly known, something which is truly universal, something that applies across time, but rather something that has everything to do with our ordinary, concrete practices for making sense of the world in ordinary life, for opening doors and using forks and spoons, to interacting with each other, especially using language. It's that form of life, it's that embodied engagement with worldly objects and with each other in social interaction, which in some sense is the background which makes possible all of our other activities, very much including science and moral philosophy. So I think, Anna, that's the way that I would respond to your observation.
Thanks so much. Wonderful. I mean, it's very bad news for many normative philosophers who would like to give you, some very straightforward principles. As it happens, I do come from Wittgensteinian tradition, so I'm very happy with this answer. Thanks.
Dan, you have a question?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I'll just pick up on one point that you made towards the end, but it's very prominent also in the book. And that's the idea that the social order is a moral order. And there's also the idea that underlying interactions, there is kind of a shared set of practices, a shared set of commitments to each other that's implied within the social interaction. But I would like to take issue with that. So much of social life is conflictual, not, kind of a shared consensus about how people should treat each other. And so if the presumption, I've taught Garfinkel quite a bit in the philosophy of social science. And one of the things which I often find is that he has no real conception of conflicting goals, manipulation, the desire to take advantage of the other player. In short, I'm kind of thinking that your Durkheimianism is giving too much credence to the idea of an overriding kind of moral consensus within the context of which maybe we have small arguments about the soup spoon versus the dining spoon.
Dan, it's a great observation. This I think is a very important observation that has a lot to do with the relationship of the interaction order tradition sociology that I'm coming from, and other approaches to sociology. There's been a lot of attempts at dialogue that have often been unsuccessful, frankly, between interaction order sociology and other approaches to sociology. It's been very hard for interaction sociologists to communicate what they're trying to do in sociology, and conversely, very hard for other approaches to sociology to understand what exactly interaction order sociologists are doing. Dan, I think you referenced Durkheim there, and I referenced Durkheim as well earlier in my presentation, is very apposite. This is a question which also is not just relevant to Durkheim, and not just relevant to Garfinkel and ethnomethodology in sociology, but also very relevant to Durkheim and sociologists and social scientists and philosophers' questions, and anthropologists' questions about what use might Durkheim continue to have today, especially since the 1960s, especially in North America, perhaps. We have highlighted sociologists which seem to have more theoretical resources for dealing with real and important conflict in social life. For example, the Holocaust. Sociologists, 19th century writers, political economists such as Marx, or sociologists like Weber, Georg Simmel, et cetera, who have more to say about conflict in social life and the foundational role of different interests in social life, and where does Durkheim fit into all that? And in that kind of broad way, sociologists of the interaction order like Irving Goffman or Harold Garfinkel or Anne Rawls, who see themselves as in some sense in a Durkheimian tradition, may seem sort of like from another planet. How exactly do you deal with real important conflict in social life? I think my short answer would be something along the lines of what the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking had to say about, in his Foucault kind of influenced way of making sense of the emergence of scientific phenomena like probability, and making sense of scientific debates in history. People who conflict with each other, groups which are at conflict with each other, often share an enormous amount. If you look beneath the surface, in order to be able to conflict with each other in many kinds of conflict, perhaps not all kinds of conflict, the two groups need to agree in practice on many things. And of course, there's a wide variety of kinds of conflict. There's conflict where different social groups are enormously different. For example, James Cook encountering the Hawaiian Islanders, that's an enormously different kind of practices, forms of life which are engaging each other, where the two parties had very real difficulties in making sense of what was going on with the other group, or Cortez in Mexico, et cetera. On the other hand, there's other forms of conflict, perhaps between Jews and non-Jewish Germans during the Holocaust, where a lot more is presupposed. For example, perhaps speaking the same language, understanding, having some sort of shared set of references, even though there's a lot of conflict. And then other forms of conflict might be, I don't know, in scientific conferences where people have different theories and different ways of explaining phenomena. Those scientific groups are in conflict with each other, but agreeing on perhaps essentials in the way that Hacking puts it, agreeing on what is perhaps most determinative, most essential in that kind of conflict, even while disagreeing on things which are relatively superficial. Also relevant here, is how scientific change happens. Thomas Kuhn and philosophy of science since the 1960s. How does scientific progress actually happen? How do scientific revolutions happen? That's probably relevant here as well. So I think it's a great question, Dan. It raises many, many kinds of issues. And my short answer would be that conflict, in my view, in my Durkheimian and interaction order view, conflict often and frequently involves some sort of agreement, shared agreement on a form of life or shared practices.
So there are 3 more questions because I had a follow-up on your questions. And I wanted just to pursue a little bit more on this identification between social order and moral order, because if I follow you, then the question of how we hold the spoon is, and to hold badly a spoon enters into the same category as killing someone, or not being grateful to someone who gave me a present. So, and also this, so this is, for me, this is not very, this counterintuitive, and I think also it goes against the way people themselves would describe what they do. In one case, we would say he's not being polite, and in the other case, we would say he's wrong, or he's a morally devious person. So I was wondering whether you could not avoid this kind of misunderstandings with the reader, or with the philosopher, or with the common sense, by specifying that when you speak about morality, you speak about morality in a terminological sense, in a technical sense. That is, you refer to the background of practices. And then everything you say is very interesting and makes lots of sense, and we learn a lot about everyday life with your book, with the different ways we resist to pressure and this kind of thing. So I was wondering whether it would not be like good response to my kind of first reaction.
Mhm. You know, perhaps another aspect of our argument, which I didn't really introduce in my presentation, might be relevant here. And that's our discussion in chapter 2 of the book of sense and self. That, of course, is part of the title. Our book title is Morality in the Making of Sense and Self. We argue in chapter 2 of the book, and here we're drawing on the interaction order sociologist Ann Rawls, that sense, meaning, and self are fundamentally moral goods that are omni-relevant in social interaction. In all social interaction, in social order per se, we are always displaying an orientation to the relevance of making sense with each other or presenting ourselves in a certain kind of a way. Sense and self are moral constructions, moral productions, moral outcomes of ordinary social interaction. And Raphael, you're positing perhaps that ordinary people may treat this kind of language or talk about morality as extrinsic, applied in from the outside by scholars to what they're doing. By contrast, I would argue, following Ann Rawls's argument, that participants in social interaction themselves, like us right now, are ceaselessly treating as relevant the production of meaning and self in the right kinds of ways. And that kind of observation about morality of interaction is grounded, that kind of observation by interaction order sociologists is grounded in the very background practices of social interactants themselves. If we look or think carefully at what we're doing right now in the way that we're treating the ongoing moment by moment production of sense making as important, as mattering, or the ongoing production of ourselves, presenting ourselves in a certain kind of a way, then I think that goes some way towards explaining Ann Rawls's argument, treating sense and self as fundamentally moral goods that are omni-relevant in social action per se. And in that sense, arguing that social order, in some quite basic and fundamental sense, is a moral order in which moral goods such as sense and self are omni-relevant, or omnipresent, or ubiquitous in all of our interactions with each other. This is a huge part of Garfinkel's work, of course, as well. And he was a very long-lived man, and he did many studies, not just from 1967 or before the 60s, presented in his famous 1967 book, Studies in Ethnomethodology, Harold Garfinkel, but also in the 70s and 80s and 90s and beyond. But in that early work, as we know, one of the famous studies that he has his UCLA students do is he has his undergrad students go out there to scenes of ordinary life, go out there to their parents, go out there to the supermarket, go out there to their friends, and try to make trouble, try to disrupt the ongoing backgrounded, concrete production of sense in ordinary life, and see what happens when you breach that ordinary production of meaning making. What results, what happens? And what Garfinkel's students found is that people have practices for immediately, for swiftly and aggressively attempting to correct that breach in meaning making and to make sense of the situation. Meaning making is a deeply important concern of ordinary people, natural language users, and it can be empirically demonstrated. Ordinary people treat the disruption of the making of meaning or the making of self as a deeply morally threatening action. If I, for example, start to spout gibberish out of my mouth and also and I keep attempting to do this very quickly, perhaps not in a conversation about meaning-making conversation, a scientific conference about philosophy, but in ordinary social life, very, very quickly, people are going to be making sense of what I'm doing and making attributions about my motives. They're making sense of this disruption of meaning making. So that would be my short answer, drawing on Ann Rawls's work on characterizing meaning-making and self-making as moral concerns in everyday social life.
I still have a follow-up to what you just said. So because I found Anur's work very fascinating, and you made me discover it, so I'm very grateful to you for this. And but when she says that it's a moral good, I think that moral is still ambiguous, because it means that it's very important for people, and they make lots of effort to save sense and self. This is what it means, but it doesn't mean moral in the usual sense, because it's not necessarily moral to save the sense or the self. Sometimes it's good, and I think in the way your book on Milgram, it shows that to try to save sense and self leads people to do bad things. Or if you take Jean-Paul Sartre, which also I think is an inspiration of Garfinkel, when he describes people who are trying to create his self, is the waiter that is playing the role of the waiter. So he's very, he denounces these people. He says that they are a salaud. I don't know how to translate it. I don't have the
inauthentic or something.
How do you say in American? How would you insult someone in this way?
A jackass.
A jackass. Okay, so
Jackass.
And so for him, it's immoral. You should save your freedom and not identify yourself with yourself, and to be ready to get rid of yourself. And so I think there are these two meanings of morality: a goal in itself that people pursue, but they might be wrong. So that's why I think it's still terminological, this Anur's use of moral.
Yeah. And it's a great observation, Raphael, and maybe it goes some way towards indicating sort of a difference in our backgrounds, in this interdisciplinary dialogue that we're having, which I think is so fruitful and so productive. I guess what I would say just very briefly is that a major concern of interaction order sociologists is also to, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, to attempt to re-specify some of these big words. Morality, as I mentioned before, it's multidimensional. It can mean many different things. Sociologists or psychologists or neuroscientists will specify what exactly they mean by morality in different ways. As I mentioned before, other huge, very broad and important concepts like power are also multidimensional. Sociologists of the interaction order often attempt to re-specify these big words by looking to the way that they're actually used in social life. So I think that would be my sort of knee-jerk response to your comment, that it really matters to make sense of the terms, the key terms that we're using. It makes sense to say what we mean when we're having a conversation about morality and power, but it may also be important for our discussion of those concepts to be in touch with the way that they're actually used, or the range of uses in our culture, in ordinary social life. What do people mean by morality? What is the range of uses, the range of settings in which that interactional tool is used to accomplish social actions in ordinary life? So just to keep it very brief, that would be my knee-jerk reaction. I just wanted to highlight as well Anna's chat comment about Aristotle. And that's one, maybe Anna, you could say more about that. I know praxis and phronesis is a Aristotelian concept which has been made a lot of, especially in Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieuan sociology is rather different from interaction order sociology, but there's many shared concerns in 20th century philosophy and social science in talking about everyday action, practical action, to use a phrase in the way that Bourdieu has been translated into English.
I'd resist here a little bit in the sense of Bourdieu, because he's using the notion of praxis, I think, much more in the Marxist tradition, which is, revolutionary action. Action is praxis in German sense and not in Greek sense, I would say. But in the Greek sense, it's an extremely banal notion that, alludes to the fact that each action can be understood as praxis, and also as poiesis or something else, but each action has the dimension of morality. And this is something that very nicely has been said also by Charleston in the UK, as someone who inspired people like Cora Diamond, whom certainly, you know, who built the Wittgensteinian tradition of moral philosophy in a way that is extremely close to Garfinkel. So this is all the same story, and there is really no tension between Aristotle and this tradition from this point of view, in the sense that each action makes sense from moral point of view. But then it does not lead you, Raphael, to put on the same level the unpolite gesture on one hand and murder on the other, because when you learn the background, you learn at the same time the elements of the important. You learn how to distinguish the relevance of element, the salience of the elements of the background. So you don't add murder to your general knowledge. It is a part of your general knowledge, just as etiquette is a part of your general knowledge. This is how you learn it. You already learn it. You learn etiquette as something that you learn to enter good society and nothing else. It's not about going to heaven or something, not killing people. It's about, you know, going to heaven or whatever. You know, this is every gesture that belongs to the family of relevant behaviors is already learned from the very beginning as potentially important or potentially just superfluous, I think.
Thank you. Nigel, you had a question?
Hi, yes, thanks very much. That was very interesting, as also the subsequent discussion. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said about disobedient subjects in the experiment. In particular, you referred to one subject saying, excusing themselves via the words, I can't go on, I just can't continue, or something to that effect. And you also observed that very few subjects referred to the moral wrongness of delivering the electric shocks to the learner. And this reminded me of Christopher Browning's analysis of the order police and the, we could say, the disobedient policemen, those policemen that stepped down from killing operations, and what they said and didn't say in order to account for it, explain their actions in the criminal investigation, some 15 years after the events. And Browning also finds, which is these two very similar forms of account of excuse. One that very few of the, let's just say, the disobedient policemen referred to the moral wrongness of killing and their stepping down as a moral imperative. On the contrary, most of them said something like, well, I just couldn't go on. I was too weak. I'm too cowardly. I'm not strong enough. So my question is, well, one, do we find a similar kind of pattern with the disobedient subjects explaining, post-experiment in the debriefing? Do we find any substantial pattern of subjects excusing themselves or explaining themselves a la Browning's disobedient policeman? Do we find experimental subjects kind of downplaying their own moral rectitude, if you like, by saying that they were not strong enough, they just weren't able to continue? Do we find that in their interviews? And also, I mean, more generally, I'm I've always been fascinated as to why people would almost seemingly deliberately reject the opportunity to kind of claim, perhaps a reasonably well-deserved, self-righteousness for behaving in the morally correct way. Why do people seem to go out of their way to deny that they acted as they did for the right moral reasons, and to claim individual weakness as the actual explanation? Why would that be the case? I mean, in the case of the order policemen, maybe it was the case that at the time, it's true, maybe it is true that their reason for stepping down was indeed that they felt themselves not up to the task of continuing. But why then would they continue, or why would they offer that as a reason, an explanation for why they behaved as they did all those years after the events, and of course outside of the context in which the peer and situational pressures were being applied?
Nigel, thanks so much for these questions. I think I would respond in the following way. I remember reading Ordinary Men, Browning's classic book from the 90s on the order police. And it's fascinating in the way that you talk about the possible similarities or congruences between the situation of those order policemen who refused to participate in the killing actions in Eastern Europe and the disobedient participants in Milgram's experiment. There's interesting similarities and parallels, and so much could be said about that. There's also important differences, as we've been talking about, very important differences. You mentioned one account that those order police made in, I think it was, I don't quite remember the book, but some sort of trials or investigations of their role some 10, 15 years after the war. And as you say, one common account among refusing policemen was that they just weren't strong enough. They just couldn't go through with it for reasons of personal weaknesses. So presenting themselves as unable to go on, but characterizing the projected action of killing Jews as not itself morally reprehensible, etc. It's a very different situation than in the Milgram scenario. And the account there puts me in mind of Riker and Haslam's engaged followership explanation of obedience in Milgram's lab, which is holding that participants identified with the experimenter, identified with Milgram, identified with science in some sense, and that goes a long way towards accounting for obedience. We don't find participants saying that, whether they're obedient or disobedient, very much in our large collection of recordings of the experiment. It's perfectly possible that participants are acting in ways that they're not conscious of, or ways that are dissembling from their true motives, things like that. But we just looking at what people say, for better or for worse, we don't find people saying things along the lines of, it was an important experiment. I'm really glad that you carried it out, regardless of whether I obeyed or disobeyed. We don't find that. So maybe that would be my short answer towards addressing the first part of your question. And I'm not remembering the second part of your question, if you wanted to remind me, or if there was some aspect of your question that I didn't address sufficiently.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, so I suppose, well, the larger puzzlement in my question is, why do people, albeit taking into account the, I guess, the expected differences in the circumstances and events, why is it that people seem almost bizarrely to refrain from, deliberately avoid the opportunity to, make themselves look good or not bad by saying that they ceased participation because they recognized that participation was just morally abhorrent? Why do we not find people saying that, at least after the events, even if they're rationalizing? I mean, that's really weird, isn't it? You would expect I mean, so even Milgram subjects in the debriefings, I understand some of those took place immediately after the experiments, but some there were further follow-up debriefings, I believe, a year or more after the original experiments.
There were questionnaires which were sent out weeks and months afterwards to all participants.
Yeah, so I'm wondering why people avoid the opportunity of, as it were, claiming the high moral ground.
It's a great observation. I think my short answer would be that in our book, we are attempting to address some why questions, especially in chapter 6 on explaining obedience, but primarily we're concerned with the how, the processes which led to those outcomes of obedient, disobedient outcomes. And regardless of the why, and I could say many things about why I think that is, the how, what we actually observe is that participants do not do that. Just focusing on disobedient participants, we do not find that disobedient participants engage in the immediately subsequent debriefing interview in morally congratulatory accounts for their behavior. They don't say things about how this was so wrong. It was a moral kind of dilemma that they found themselves in, and they chose to do the right thing, and I'm a really great person because of that. They don't do that. And maybe the puzzle for us, having sort of established a little bit more of what actually happened in the experiment, is to use that growing body of factual knowledge of what actually happened in the experiment to perhaps ask the very questions you're asking based on new knowledge, accumulating new knowledge about what actually happened in the experiment. Why is that the case? And at this point, I don't have a short answer for you.
Just a quick follow-up. So I think there might be an explanation for the version from condition from 1 to 20, because in these conditions, people didn't know that it was a hoax, so they were not asked to justify themselves. So they thought that as you explain in your book, Milgram told them that it was just the machine was calibrated to inflict shocks to small animals. So then it's very dangerous. Actually, it's very dangerous for a small rat or something. So people didn't think that they did the right thing when they disobeyed, because they didn't think it was the wrong thing to obey, because they didn't know that the experiment was about them. They were just the debriefing just told them, okay, you didn't send very, very dangerous shocks into the persons. So I think the question should be asked about the conditions between 20 and 23, because then they knew that the question was whether they are moral or not, or whether they are heroes or not.
That's really interesting. Can I just add, one more kindred phenomenon from the other side, as it were, another very well attested finding of testimony, in this case, rescuers of Jews in Nazi-occupied territories. The striking finding that rescuers very often renounce any suggestion that what they did was morally exceptional or morally heroic. They insist that they just did what anybody would do, whilst of course knowing full well that that wasn't actually the case, that what they did is absolutely not what everybody would do, albeit probably what everybody should have done. So this does seem to be quite a widespread phenomenon of renouncing any exceptional morality on the part of people that do in fact do the right thing.
So maybe just to sort of sum up, maybe this point in this part of our discussion, it maybe the comment is about heroism in general. Is there something that Milgram's studies can tell us about the phenomenon of heroism and the way that people who are often described retrospectively as heroes account for their heroic actions?
Yeah, obviously, I don't know, which is kind of why I'm asking you the question also. But my hunch might be, and my suggestion would be, that it somehow it probably does fit your kind of moral, sociological, theoretical standpoint, that there's something about, you know, being completely absorbed in a moralized situation that makes it the case that people don't experience themselves as having done anything other than what the situation, you know, just, you know, rationally, intelligibly required of them at that time.
That may be, and there, I assume in heroism, there's a wide variety of ways of being a hero, but perhaps across all those situations and contexts, possibly something intrinsic to heroism has to do with that that particular moral stance towards one's actions, that one does not congratulate oneself, that one does not celebrate one's own actions, but rather the heroism is attributed by other people to oneself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. You know, one is tempted to respond in exactly that way, that people are being, as it were, second order morally good by being, you know, rather charmingly humble. But I have my doubts, actually, that this is, and of course, it isn't just Holocaust rescuers that respond with that famous, I was just doing what anybody would do. One finds it all the time in almost every account of heroic rescue that I've ever seen. People say exactly the same thing. I don't know, my hunch is, you know, perhaps it is in fact a realistic commentary on one's actual experience of agency at the time.
Mini, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so it's not my discipline since I'm a neuroscientist, but I think something that is striking to me is that so there is a huge focus on Milgram studies and the Holocaust, but all of this is very Western centered, actually. And you know, I've been traveling in Rwanda, in Cambodia to interview the genocide of perpetrators, but also the rescuers to see what they have to say, what they can reveal in other cultures. And it's very interesting because both in the experiments that you have conducted on obedience, but also many of the genocide perpetrators in Rwanda, the main reason they claim why they participated is because they just obeyed orders. And they say that their morality was just blurred because they were convinced that it was the right thing to do. And in Cambodia, they also all mentioned that they participated in the genocide made by the Khmer Rouge because they just obeyed orders. And interestingly, and I agree with your opinion that the engaged followership theory is perhaps not explaining everything, because in Cambodia, for instance, I've been told many times, we were not forced, we did not believe in their political vision, but we just did obey orders. For them, it was just normal from a cultural perspective to just obey the orders of someone. And something that was also very striking in Rwanda, when we did that study and conducted in-depth interviews with those who obeyed orders and those who disobeyed orders, is that some who disobeyed, most of them almost mentioned morality, but there were really not a lot, sorry. But what is interesting is for those who obeyed orders and administered the painful shock to the other person. So in this experiment, there were real shocks. And we had in one experimental condition, an explanation, like we told our participants, look, in this situation, we know we are asking you immoral actions. It was explicitly stated, but you are an adult, a responsible person, so you are free to decide to follow or not these orders. And we give them a paper to make them give a signature to say, I understand that as an adult, I'm responsible for my decisions and so on. So it may be weird for us, but in Rwanda, it's very culturally important to emphasize that they can make their own decision as adults. And it's crazy because in the debriefing, even though we were offering them the possibility to not send painful electric shocks qualified as immoral actions to someone else, they almost all obeyed, and they almost all give the reason, well, I didn't want to screw up the study, I didn't want to have the experimenter acquiring bad data and so on. And it was really, really striking the way morality can be perceived in different contexts, but also how some people do not even use these escape doors that we offer to them. And I interviewed some writers, some real rescuers in Rwanda as well. And most of them, yeah, they mention morality, but not systematically. It seems that most of them, they report that, well, they could not act because they felt a great empathy for others, but also because they have this common, this aspect of shared humanity. For them, there is not a single difference between all human beings. We are all the same, all from the same family. And so there is no reason to be associated with a process of dehumanization or categorization. We just must act. It's not regardless if it's immoral or not moral, we are all the same. And although I understand that most of the studies and discussions are Western-centered in a way, with Milgram studies or with the Holocaust, I think it's also critical to go beyond, because Westerners are clearly a small proportion of the human population, and the question of morality is so broad and can be so different across cultures that I think it would really actually deserve to go beyond and to meet those people and to just get a broader overview.
It's a great point. I totally agree that so much of our attempts to make sense of the Holocaust and also the Milgram experiment are very, very deeply Eurocentric. And to start to challenge those kinds of presuppositions, both through explorations in space, going to different places in the world today, in recent years, like Cambodia and Rwanda, is crucially important. And also time, going back in history and thinking about perhaps atrocities and genocide in historical settings as well. I think all those will go a very long way, of course, challenging some of the presuppositions, the Eurocentric presuppositions that we bring to the Holocaust and to Milgram. I think this perspective that you bring as a neuroscientist, I think, is fascinating. And I'm not sure, Emily, if you're the only neuroscientist in this room, but as I mentioned before, this is precisely the kind of audience that I'm so happy is involved in discussing our book. We're really trying to promote this kind of dialogue, and I'm fully prepared to be challenged in our work by things that we're just ignorant of when confronted with other approaches to studying morality. As I said, I'm a sociologist. We're especially working within the interaction order in sociology. We've tried very hard to learn more about other aspects of the new science of morality, but it is so large. And I would say that neuroscience is definitely perhaps the area of the new science of morality that I am most ignorant about.
Thank you. Karsten, you have a question?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. That was great. Just to pick up on a few remarks in the discussion, and also what I think Dan pointed out. I mean, it seems to me you think about morality here as what sometimes is just called normativity in the social psychology. So we have a variety of normative commitments, and one of the assumptions in the Milgram experiment seems to be that the avoidance of harm norm should trump all the other normative commitments. And if you look at social psychologists like Haidt or Turowetz, and Turowetz actually talked about the Milgram experiment, it's not so clear that this is actually always the case, because if you think about corporeal punishment or something like that, harm avoidance is not necessarily trumping anything else. And I think from that perspective, a commitment to obedience of authority is certainly something that has a very central role in our embeddedness in a kind of social context. For Haidt, it's actually one of the moral modules that he thinks, one of the moral foundations that he identifies. And it's one of those things that are sometimes in conflict with the module of harm avoidance. And Turowetz also thinks about what's happening in the Milgram experiment as a kind of negotiation between a kind of conventional norm and a moral norm. But it seems to me one of the reasons that people might say, oh, I just couldn't do it, is that they actually acknowledge their moral failings in some sense of living up to the norm of obedience to authority. That's what they are supposed to do. And certainly within the context of war, et cetera, that might actually play an important role. So there are different duties that they kind of negotiate, and it's not so clear. And those duties have kind of equal importance in some sense. Only in that kind of situation, only on reflection, stepping back, you might recognize that you actually violated a moral norm from a Kantian sense. But from a kind of social, I'm just wondering whether you can play with that a little bit in those kind of experiments. I mean, as my grandfather, who tended to be conservative, used to say, before you want to lead, you have to learn how to obey. I mean, that's this kind of Germanic think about your duty to obey. And so I think people are conflicted in those kind of situations. And I'm just wondering whether I mean, the Wittgensteinian kind of perspective maybe doesn't allow you sufficiently to distinguish between kinds of norms and commitments that we have, and that we negotiate between them on a daily basis in some sense. And that seems to be something that's going on.
Karsten, I really appreciate your comment. I would agree with you that there is an orientation to a conflict of duty, as you put it. We describe in terms of responsibility in the book. So we talk about a conflict between the responsibility, the ordinary norms of responsibility that one has to the learner who's crying out in pain, who's demanding to be released, and the other, the orientation to the responsibility to the experimenter. One has volunteered for this experiment, one has showed up at the lab, has received a check for $450, has agreed to participate in this experiment, and there's a kind of responsibility that participants orient to. And it's that conflict between duties, as you put it, or responsibilities, as we put it, that is the heart of the moral dilemma there. And perhaps that says a lot about moral dilemmas in general. It's a situation of civil disobedience, and Milgram explicitly talks about civil disobedience. It's a situation of Antigone. It's a situation of Henry David Thoreau. It's a situation where there is this perceived, felt conflict between different sources of responsibility or norm, a conflict between one's duty to obey, one's duty as a citizen in Antigone or in Thoreau, and the other hand, one's orientation to something which goes beyond, which is more universal, Kant's moral law, or something which has to do with ordinary responsibility to a fellow suffering human being. So I feel like we do. I think I'm frozen on the screen. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll just keep talking. We do attempt to make that distinction between tension between sources of responsibility in the book.
Can I just, I mean, the Antigone conflict, though, and would be a conflict where I kind of am aware of the conflict between different principles, right? Different moral principles. And just listening to what you say, how people explain themselves, it doesn't seem as if they appeal to a different kind of moral principle. It just seems as if they appeal to maybe certain, I mean, and it would be interesting to look at it. I think people resist more if they are in close contact with a person receiving the shocks. I'm just wondering whether the appeal to a moral principle or a certain kind of sympathetic feeling that seems to go against their recognition that they actually have a responsibility to listen to the experimenter. So do they actually experience it as an Antigone conflict, or do they more experience it as, oh, I really don't feel like doing this, but I really have to do what the experimenter said, I just can't. And so that was a different kind of conflict and from the perspective of the subject. That's just the question that I would have.
Yeah. And I think what we found, just to sum up something relevant from our findings to your question, is that we find that to be successful in the Milgram situation, to be disobedient, it is not necessary by any means to invoke explicitly issues of moral principle, which is something that we might expect. We might expect going into a study of how the Milgram experiment actually happened, that those people who were successful, who were disobedient, did invoke morality in some explicit sense. We might expect that they do say things like, I refuse on moral grounds, which is something that one disobedient participant does say. But that is extremely rare and very unusual. And we find that to successfully resist that kind of resistance, explicit invocation of morality, is very infrequent, is not necessary. What is the way that participants succeed in disobeying is by using one of the 6 forms of resistance that we've identified, with the most explicit, perhaps counterintuitively, simply being saying something like, I can't go on, or I'm unwilling to go on, or I refuse to go on. And there are accounts perhaps for that refusal or that unwillingness, that attempt to stop the experiment. But in the Milgram situation, all you have to do is continue to sustain that resistance in order to eventually get the experimenter to bring the experiment to an end. So the Milgram situation, it's similar in some ways to situations of other moral dilemmas. It's similar in some ways to the situation faced by Browning's order police, but it's also very, very different. To be disobedient, to successfully resist in Milgram's lab, all you had to do was resist 4+ times to the experimenter's prods, and then he would end the experiment. Participants didn't know that he would end the experiment after successfully resisting 4 of the prods, but that's how you achieve disobedience in Milgram's setting.
Paul, you have a question?
Yes, Matt just touched on this. Yeah, as I'm sure Matt knows, right, Milgram and Zimbardo knew each other since high school, and right, they follow this very sort of similar, interesting career trajectory. But I once read a transcript of a conversation between them, and what emerged, to both of their surprise, was the sense in which resistance was vastly understudied in the social psychology literature as opposed to conformity. Right, and it's really dominated the conversation so far here. That is the conformity aspect. Yet your own work, and this is what my question. It's less a question than an invitation for you to say a bit more. You're one of the few people I've ever read, you and Jason Turowetz, who, as it were, look at the conditions of resistance, right, and not just focus on the conformity. Is fascinating as that certainly is. And I guess I'd just like to invite you to say a little bit more. You just did, but it seems to me, given both the importance of being a resistor and the fact that it's, by comparison, vastly understudied, what do you see coming from your own work as an invitation to further understand what allows people to be resistors in these situations?
Mm-hmm. Paul, thanks for your comment. Resistance is indeed the heart of our book. It's the focal concrete practice that we study in the Milgram experiment. I would say that our focus on resistance is not unique. It's there are several other scholars in the second wave of Milgram studies, like Stephen Gibson, like David Kaposi, et cetera, who have Ethan Hoffman, who have focused on resistance. It's certainly different in the second wave of Milgram studies than in the initial reaction, the first several decades up through the 90s, where definitely the focus was on obedience and conformity. And it's fascinating to hear about that sort of anecdotal conversation between Milgram and Zimbardo about conformity and obedience, and on the other hand, resistance. I think of Ash's line experiments too from the 50s, where of course the phenomenon was conformity, but resistance would be an equally interesting phenomenon to study in Ash's lab. And again, the British psychologist John Ray has an interest in looking at Ash's line experiment studies. I think the upshot of at least our focus on resistance in our book has to do with some of the things that I've mentioned. One is that resistance is a shared practice by both obedient and disobedient outcome participants. And I think that's just fascinating. You know, if we haven't, like maybe going back 25 years, 30 years, the literature, if we don't really know what happened in Milgram's lab, we might simply assume that obedient participants were like, you know, the Eichmann-like robots that Hannah Arendt describes, and they simply obeyed orders, and that was more or less it. But the reality is much more nuanced and more complex. There's a lot of things that obedient and disobedient outcome participants share. It's fascinating that the kinds of resistance practices, these 6 resistive practices that we identify in chapter 4 of the book, they are used by disobedient participants, but also all of those practices are also found in our collection of obedient participants. What differed was not really the forms of resistance that the 2 outcome groups use, but rather the way that those tools were used. And that probably has a lot of relevance to many, many situations that are Milgram-esque or otherwise. It has something to do with being skilled, with receiving training, with the ability to learn how to act in competent ways in a wide variety of situations. Several years ago, I was invited to write a short piece for the Huffington Post. I called it How to Be a Hero. One lesson perhaps from our research is that it may provide us with a way of learning more about what ordinary people like you and me can do in difficult situations involving unethical authority to more successfully enact our resistance. We may resist, but in relatively ineffective ways. We might be able to learn some things from resistors in Milgram's lab who were successful in resisting. And I would sum up those successful ways of resisting in the following way. It's important to resist early. You should, in order to be successful in resistance in Milgram's lab, you need to start that resistance early. We find that in our collection of recordings, disobedient outcome participants, they initiate their first overt resistance to the experimenter at a lower shock level. The median shock level is lower among the disobedient participants than it is among the obedient participants. In addition to resisting early, it's also important to use a wide variety of resistive practices. Disobedient participants have a wider repertoire of forms of resistance than any particular obedient participant. In addition to those points, it's also important to sustain that resistance. This is important, obviously, in the Milgram setting, but it may also be relevant to a wide variety of other settings, Milgram-esque or otherwise, in social life. In order to resist effectively, it's important to be persistent, to sustain that resistance. Those are important points about resistance, which are all grounded in a more detailed understanding of the facts of what actually happened in Milgram's lab.
Elodie, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I also had interrogations on your perspective on morality as emerging in the interaction. So maybe you already partly answered my integration, but I will try to add some, to push a little more in this on this point. So my concern was that on the one hand, you argue that morality emerges from the interaction itself because a moral framing of the situation emerges from the discourse of the teacher. But on the other hand, this moral framing of the situation is initiated by the teacher if he feels that morality has been violated. But then it seems to me that it means that the teacher refers to morality as something pre-existing to the situation or something transcendent, to which he compares normatively the situation. So this suggests that the teacher's practices from which morality appears in interaction rely on morality with a big M as a system of norms structuring this interaction and not emerging from it. And my concern was that if there is a morality of interaction, then morality does not emerge in some specific situations in the sense of taking its source in those. It is not simply produced in these specific interactions, while the other situations and interactions would be amoral. Morality seems rather to be a normative order that is irreducible to any type of situation or interaction, but can be put into question by any, especially, but not exclusively, the situation where it is violated. So maybe we should conceive of morality as encompassing any human situation in the same way that the social, as Durkheim conceives of it. So the matter of the psychological and interactional mechanisms by which morality is performed or enacted may not exhaust morality in itself. So I was wondering how you put in relation the descriptive matter and the normative concern with morality. So my idea was the following. You say that disobedient participants follow a golden rule and a letting the learner decide principle. So the golden rule is do unto others as you would have others do unto you, and the letting the learner decide principle is L is an autonomous person with the right to decide whether he wants to continue. So these rules are nothing but moral principles that a normative study of the moral aspects of Milgram experiments could investigate, as Mr. Stuber was maybe saying. So we can wonder if the golden rule is a kind of Thalian law, and if the letting the learner decide principle implements something like the Kantian moral of autonomy. On the contrary, the doing being the ordinary that is the explanation that you finally endorse for the behavior of the participants evokes something like a conception of morality as consisting in inter-individual obligations, which evokes maybe Bergson's, because in Les deux sources de la morale et de la religion, Bergson develops a conception of morality inspired by sociology, especially Durkheim, as consisting in moral obligation, social obligation we have to each other. So, and he conceives of this social obligation as having a constraining force on our behavior because it is incorporated through learning, and the aim is to harmonize society, to inscribe individuals in hierarchical relationships, and to make the behavior predictable as if by natural determinism. So this is how morality is kind of incorporated as a second nature. So my question was, does the interactionist approach of morality that you endorse imply a specific conception of morality, for instance, as based on social obligations like Bergson's? Or does it reject any such normative conception of morality while assuming that we should only study psychological mechanisms or sociological mechanisms in a descriptive but not normative perspective?
Thank you, Elodie, very much for your question. And maybe I could just preface my response by saying I'm not a philosopher, and I'm certainly not a moral philosopher, and my knowledge of moral philosophy is very limited. It's so interesting to think about the ways that sociologists, a social scientist like Durkheim has been influential. He has had an enormous amount of influence, certainly not just in sociology and anthropology, but in a wide variety of areas. And you're teaching me things about his influence in moral philosophy, for example, in Henri Bergson, and in, I assume, the 1920s work of Bergson having to do with moral philosophy. And that's work that I'm not familiar with. I would say, I think my short answer to your question would point back to some of the points that I made earlier about the way that the interaction order tradition sociology claims that its points about morality are treated as relevant, are treated as mattering by participants in everyday social life. When, for example, a disruption or breach in sense-making is brought about, or a disruption in a particular way of presenting self or identity is brought about, we sanction each other. We punish and we promote each other and certain ways of making sense and presenting self. And in that sense, social interaction itself, the concrete practices of social interaction, are a self-regulating mechanism in some sense. The practices themselves are where the social order is being ceaselessly produced. And that moral order is in some important sense intrinsically a moral order for enforcing norms, for enforcing moral common sense about the way that sense ought to be made, about the way that people ought to present themselves in certain kinds of self and identity. There's certainly so much more that could be said by other people than myself who know a lot more about moral philosophy and how that understanding of morality in interaction order sociology may or may not link up to or have connections or disagreements with particular aspects of moral philosophy like Bergson, but that might be best for another person more expert in moral philosophy than myself.
Okay, thank you for your reply. That's helpful. Thank you.
So yes, now we spent lots of time. It's your fault, Matt, because it was so interesting, your talk. So we all wanted to have more to ask questions, but now we are very late. So I think what we should do is to have first the comments, and then a new question session. I don't know if I explain me. So first, Elodie, you present your the questions, or you wanted to ask Matt, then Emily, then Paul, then Dan, and then Matt, you respond, and then we have questions. Is that all right with you in this way? Okay,
That's
because
sounds fine to
otherwise
me.
everyone won't manage to present his questions and her questions. So okay, let's do it like this. Good. So Elodie?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I can make it short because I already did what I had to say on morality. So my two other concerns were with the perspective on the moral self and with the perspective on the social. So concerning the moral self, I understand your view as saying that morality is not should not be seen as implemented by mental states located in the mind of the individual, but rather we should study morality as constituted in intersubjective and publicly observable practices. So I think it's true, but it does not seem to me to exclude the relevance of the notion of some mental states in the explanation of the behavior of the individuals, because the mental state don't have to be conceived of as entities located anywhere. We can think of those as intentional structures that are necessitated by an interpretation of human behavior. And to explain morality in terms of interactional strategies of power and resistance seems to me to implicitly presuppose such intentional interpretations, so mental state attributions without explicitly dealing with it. But for instance, in chapter 8, you write that our analysis of resistance and compliance has also shown how the moral or immoral or amoral self is reflexively tied to the social situations where it is produced or rather co-produced. So the consequence of the irrelevance of any explanations of morality in terms of individual moral actions and intentions is that we should not talk about the mental state that we attribute to individuals to explain their behavior, but we should rather focus on the interactional practices or in the inter-individual practices. But it seems to me that morality is about subjects having moral rights and duties and responsibilities. So I'm not sure that we can reduce the subjectivity to a functional role or to a status in an interaction, like the grammatical category to which some philosophers inspired by Wittgenstein tend to reduce the subject. So I agree that we should avoid the view where the individual is in an agentic state and is passive in face of authority, as well as the situational determinism where the individual simply reacts to stimuli. I agree that the right view is that the moral self is kind of constituted through interactions and practices with other individuals. But then I wonder, who is this moral self? What is this subjectivity that emerges out of practices? So who is this I that performs a certain line of behavior consisting in a series of acts of resistance or power? So to account for morality in an interaction, it seems to me that we need to describe the behavior of the subjects of this interaction in intentional terms, thereby with mental states like beliefs and desires, for instance. So I think that agentivity and intentionality are the two central notions if we want to explain human behavior, especially morality. So morality as, I quote, related to human behavior considered as good or bad, as I think it is your acception of morality as stated in chapter 2. So if we have not two categories of subjects in Milgram's experiments, obedient and disobedient, but 4, minimally obedient, maximally obedient, etc., or maybe a continuum, we still need to explain who is where on this continuum and why. So, and we also need to explain why the individual behave differently in the lab setting than what we would have expected in view of their personality. Because in chapter 7, about the ethics of the experiment, you report that in the debriefings following the trials, a central concern is to allow the participant to believe that their behavior in the experiment did not reflect their true self or the kind of person they are. So what does this mean? Is there like a true self that gets, something like a true self that gets alienated in the experiment? And then how does this specific interaction create this kind of alienation? Or which self is there in the experiment if not the true one? Does it mean that the practical self that emerges from his line of behavior in the experimental setting is not the same than usual? But then why? How should we conceive of this immoral self that emerges in the interaction? Yeah, and should we not explain his behavior by attributing an agentivity and intentionality to him, so some mental states, as a way of interpreting his behavior? And my other point on the social was a bit also about the subjectivity and the subjects involved in the experiment. So my question is that in the morality as emerging, in the interactionist approach of morality, I think that I was surprised that the social, properly speaking, is not really taken into account. I mean, the social as a thick layer of historically situated facts and determinations like social class, gender, the type of society in which we live, etc. So I was wondering how we could integrate that kind of classic conception of what the social is with the interactionist approach. And maybe if we want to include social determinants in the explanation of Milgram-esque behavior, we need to gain historical perspective on the self. So my idea was this, maybe we need to develop a conception of the self that does not separate the psychic and the social, but integrates these two dimensions of subjectivity in a historical conception of human selves as shaped by the co-evolution of the society and of our psychic apparatus, so to say. So this direction of research, the direction of research I have in mind is the one that was opened by Norbert Elias with the notion of process of civilization, that is a historical process of internalizing constraints. So according to Elias, human societies tend to use less external constraint and power on individuals because our psyche modified itself along history by internalizing these constraints. And that is how we became able to obey authority, or more generally, to observe social obligations without being threatened by force. And at the end of his career, Elias wrote a book entitled The Germans, in which he hypothesized a decivilization process to explain the Third Reich and the Holocaust. So he suggested that the Holocaust was a civilizational collapse characterized by a regression in the civilization process. But maybe what Milgram's experiment suggests is rather that it could be the product, that the Holocaust could be the product or the result of the civilization process itself, since it is the internalized constraint itself that makes individuals obey the command of torturing another human being, instead of a lack of constraint or a regression to uncivilized instinct. So maybe what we need is to investigate this hypothesis of civilized subjects as having internalized the constraint that can make them behave against morality itself, and morality as something like being good to other human beings. This would be a historical perspective on human beings that would be a bit different from the evolutionary point of view that Milgram suggests concerning the agentic state, since at some point he writes that the agentic state was inherited from natural selection. So instead of speculating about that kind of biological acquisition, we can look for an explanation of ourselves as social and having psychic determinations as well in a shorter duration of time, namely the time of the human history. And I think that this kind of approach would fit with intuitions of historians like Browning, because you quote Browning in the last chapter as having supported the generalization of Milgram results to the explanation of the Holocaust. And in fact, Browning quotes Milgram's in the conclusive chapter of the book about the man, the ordinary man. But he writes that as this man, namely the men of the 101st Battalion of the Ordnungspolizei who got involved in the Shoah, were ordinary men. So they were ordinary men, so there is no other explanation to their behavior than Milgram's obedience to authority. But he characterized this behavior as, I quote, deference as a result of the socialization process. So this last expression does not necessarily suggest something like an agentic state that was inherited from natural selection, but rather a socialization process, so a shaping of the human being, of the human self, by social determinants, as well as acting on his psychological determinations along history. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, Elodie, thanks so much. Thanks so much for your comments and for the time that you have spent in working out and thinking about those comments, for the close reading of our book as well. I really appreciate that. I think there's two overall themes that I hear in your comments, and I could just speak to those pretty briefly. And I don't have definitive answers, I think, for them, because they're pretty large and important themes, I think. One has to do with the relationship of ethnomethodology, or the interaction order sociology with other approaches to social science. And the second theme that I hear has to do with ethnomethodology's approach to cognitivism and behaviorism as useful ways of performing social science. And I can just say some very brief things. They're very big themes. And again, I don't have definitive answers for either of those themes. I think with respect to the first question, one of the major critiques of ethnomethodology over the years is that ethnomethodology has difficulty in dealing with issues of history and also issues of inequality, power, conflict. This goes back to a point that Dan, you made earlier. There's a lot more thinking that I think, in my opinion, needs to be done among maybe both sides of this controversy or discussion between people very strongly influenced by Garfinkel, ethnomethodologists on the one hand, and interaction order sociologists, and sociologists who see something of value in the Garfinkel tradition, but are sort of mystified or hung up on the seeming inability of the Garfinkel tradition to deal with, to conceptualize, to analyze history, conflict, and so forth. Perhaps this topic today, social science and the Holocaust, and also Milgram, is a great topic for us to all continue to think about this topic, because I don't have definitive answers on this. The Holocaust obviously is a historical topic. Milgram, of course, is a historical topic as well. And what we do in the book is in some sense history of science. We're taking a social scientific approach to a classic experiment in North American social psychology from the mid-century, trying to better understand the presuppositions of that work, the import of that work, both at the time and today, and what possible significance it might have for the Holocaust. Conflict, inequality, power, obviously deeply important themes to the Holocaust, and also themes important to the Milgram experiment. And so how can an interaction order approach get at some of those themes? And I think I'll just leave my response to that question there because, again, I don't have definitive answers in addition to what I've already previously said. The second overall theme that I hear in your comment has to do with ethnomethodology's approach to a classic debate between cognitivism and behaviorism in making sense of human social behavior, the classic topic of social psychology, human social behavior. This was a debate that, of course, was especially prominent in the 1960s, 1970s. Major figures were Skinner and Chomsky. Since that time, in the last 50 plus years, there's been a number of different ways of trying to go beyond that debate and thinking about third ways, so to speak, that go beyond the limitations of both cognitivism and behaviorism. And ethnomethodology very much sees itself as one of those third ways. There's certainly other ways. There's other ways of bridging that gap or going beyond that old debate. But ethnomethodology sees itself as not being behaviorist, not simply denying the importance of mental states in the way that you describe, in the way that Watson or Skinner did, as epiphenomena, as not really existing, but on the other hand, not being cognitivist in denying the causal role that mental representations, mental states are often taken to have in the Chomskyan kind of tradition. And many scholars have argued that Chomsky has many important assumptions that go back very far in the history of philosophy of mind, rationalist metaphysics of mind, and, for example, Descartes. The approach to these questions and questions of mentality that ethnomethodology takes is often described as non-cognitivist. So a word that just seeks to be a word which is different from cognitivism, behaviorism. Beyond that, I think I'll just stop my discussion because they're very big themes. And just once more, I don't have definitive answers to them. I would like to highlight, though, that I think that these are very important themes, the themes that you've brought up. What exactly is the relationship between EM and other approaches to social science? How can ethnomethodology more effectively deal with issues of history, power, and inequality and conflict? And also, the ethnomethodological approach to mentality is now several decades old. Today, in the third decade of the 21st century, what can we bring in an interdisciplinary way to these aging third ways, going beyond cognitivism and behaviorism, in order to develop adequate explanations, understandings of human motivation and behavior?
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily?
Yes, thank you. So I'm not really going to comment based on the sociological perspective, because I'm probably the least expert of all of you in this regard. But when I was reading the book, and actually I think it's most of the time the same, I think something very critical that should be missing in this literature is a very more global interdisciplinary approach. like an historical perspective has been mentioned, but I think we can go far beyond to really have a global perspective of what is happening. For instance, I frequently see discussion about the Milgram studies regarding the agentic state theory, and you have some authors that agree or disagree with this vision. But in neuroscience, for instance, there have been several studies using implicit measurements of agency or even MRI scanners to show what it does to your brain regarding agency and responsibility when you obey orders. There are also some studies with MRI or electroencephalography who show that when you obey orders of immoral orders, it impacts how the brain processes the pain of others, what you call in neuroscience empathy, but also your interpersonal feeling of guilt. And activities in those brain regions are reduced when people obey orders. And we have also some studies showing that, yeah, when the brain regions associated with empathy, such as the insula or the entire intellectual cortex, are more active when we witness the pain of someone else, it helps people to disobey more in a setup when they have to inflict electric shocks to someone else. And I think overall, I think it's very important to really try to integrate all this knowledge into something more broad and more common, because even regarding the notion of morality, indeed, there is a huge literature in neuroscience. And what is interesting is that there are some brain networks associated with moral decision makings, which involve different brain regions. And those brain regions can also have slightly different functions. Some are more related to the reward it costs to have to conduct moral actions. Some other brain regions may be more associated with like the perceived incongruence between your own values and the outcome that you might see. And actually that's interesting because depending on the population, even though you can find the same brain regions activated during moral decision making, based on the context or the environment of those populations, this can change. For instance, you have made a study recently, well, this one is not published yet, with military in an MRI scanner. And we observe compared to civilians, and when they have to obey orders to hurt another person in an immoral, with immoral actions, they have some brain regions regarding morality that are common with civilians, but they also have other brain regions that are very different because the way they perform action and the way they perceive morality of their actions regarding what they are asked to do is totally different. And I think it might be very valuable to bring also together all this knowledge to really have like, yeah, a greater or a better overview of the problematic. In addition to my previous comment regarding difference in cultures that I think are crucial to also integrate, not to focus only on the Western populations. But yeah, I think, yeah, that was something I was sometimes missing to have, because I could see some arguments and then I say, oh yeah, but there are some answers that could be found in the neuroscience research, for instance, which were not described. And I understand why, of course, because that's not a book about such research. But I think it might be important to also consider this.
Emily, thanks so much. And I totally acknowledge that our ignorance about the neuroscience of morality that, again, has exploded in the last 20 plus years or so is a gap in the book. We wave our hands in the direction of neuroscience, psychology, and sociology as being major fields in which the new science of morality has taken place. But neuroscience is the area that we are least knowledgeable about, Jason and myself. So I'm being informed right now about important research in neuroscience. I would love to learn more about those major findings, and it would be wonderful to try to, in future work, not just by myself and Jason, but also among perhaps other people in this virtual room, to pursue that work of further integration, ways that current things are known about the new science of morality can build on each other among these different major areas of neuroscience, psychology, and sociology, drawing as well on the important expertise that many people have in this room in psychology, in philosophy and history as well.
Thanks. Stephen, you have a question?
Steve, I think you're muted.
Muted.
Stephen, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. I apologize for coming late. I got the hour completely wrong. And so I've been listening with intense interest. I have a question. I mean, I've been reading a lot of the stuff and I've read Matt's book, or at least I've read quite a bit of it, and I'm fascinated by the whole thing. And everything you've been saying fascinates me. But there's one particular thing. I want to ask Emily a question, because what she said before and what she's just said now intrigues me, and I just want to know more. I mean, neuroscience, the neuroscientific approach to morality, of course, is an attempt to arrive at truths about the brain that are to pursue a study which is by definition universal. I mean, it's about human beings' brains anywhere, and yet she's also what you said earlier, Emily, about cultural differences is about and work you've done in Cambodia, Rwanda, is about difference. And I'm trying to put this together and how you think about this. And in particular, I didn't get, and I'd like to know more about the way in which you think the work that, for instance, the work on Milgram and the work about the Holocaust and Browning, all that we've been discussing, why is that Eurocentric? What is it? I didn't really grasp where you think the real, so to speak, ethnocentricity of all this work lies. What is it that you've learned about non-European contexts, which makes you, on which you, I didn't understand what it was that rendered the work that we're talking about when we're talking about Milgram and Browning and the rest of it. What makes that somehow local and specific rather than of universal interest? And what is it, and how does that relate to the neuroscience? This is an area of puzzlement to me.
Yeah, so there are several questions and several answers to this. I'm going to try to be very clear. So what I'm saying is that not everything is expected to be different across cultures, for instance. Of course, we are the same species. For sure, we have some commonalities. And so I do not say that for sure we will have differences across cultures. But the truth is, when we come to study human behaviors, which are extremely complex to study because they can be influenced by so many factors, culture is a big one. The culture, the education, your own history from your own country can deeply influence your decisions and the way you justify your decisions. So I think that even though huge conclusions can be made when you study Westerners or Western participants, it doesn't necessarily mean that discussing on what they say would apply to the entire species of human beings. And I think this is where, and I know it's not common to go beyond the borders of our own culture to study those questions, but I think it's very crucial. And, you know, something very interesting I noticed is that when we think about real life events in Europe, for instance, or in the US, when we think about obedience to authority, one of the main historical events we have in mind is the Nuremberg trial, where senior Nazi officers claim, oh, I just followed orders. And one of the research projects I tried to make in Rwanda and Cambodia on former genocide perpetrator is to see if such justifications, regardless of whether they are made because they want to avoid prosecution or because this is what they somehow implicitly feel or preconsciously feel, I don't know how to say that, could other people say the same, for instance? Is it a main reason or the fact that you can be rather influenced by following groups of people, for instance? Can all of this be shared by different cultures? And indeed, that's interesting because when we interview genocide perpetrators in Rwanda, for instance, or in Cambodia, they all claim the same, while it was different events in history, different timeline, and it's unlikely that they met each other to share this justification of I just follow orders. So it's interesting to see that there are indeed some commonalities between members of our species regarding what people say when they try to justify why they obey orders.
Mhm.
But regarding disobedience per se, for instance, when I was in Cambodia, that situation of the Cambodian genocide is really puzzling me, because 100% of the 60 former Khmer Rouge we interviewed said, I followed orders. And it was impossible to find anyone who could have acted as a rescuer at that period. I do not say that they do not exist. I just could not find any of them, even though I worked with an NGO, for instance, working since 20 years in Cambodia and collecting interviews of the survivors and perpetrators of the Khmer Rouge regime. And it seems interesting.
I didn't understand that. You couldn't find one what?
Rescuers. So those who said no, actually, to the regime and didn't refuse to kill another person, for instance, for the regime. And it's really puzzling, because it seems when I was discussing with all of them about why they didn't even try, it seems that for them, their cultural relationship to authority was very strong. And for them, I would say an order is an order. It's a bit not easy to use that sentence, because of course that's been also used during the Nuremberg trial. But it seems that the possibility to disobey, and why we put so much emphasis on those people who can resist and say no, is also because our own moral values as Westerners are really emphasizing the importance of these people. Oh, they are great, they could say no. But it may not be the case in other cultures, where resistance to orders may be as culturally inappropriate. So that's also why I say it's important to see what are the commonalities and differences between those cultures by going beyond, in order to have a greater overview of what can prevent people to comply with immoral orders. The neuroscience part is actually a different approach. For me, it's very important to combine both approaches. You have the interviews with those who truly perpetrated acts of obedience to kill other person in a genocide, not only participants in a study, because it's just a study, and a neuroscience approach where we investigate what is happening in the brain or in the brain of the perpetrators. That's a project that I'm going to start in Rwanda in a couple of months, where we will also put former genocide perpetrators in an MRI scanner. But these are just two different approaches to understand together how the notion of obedience to authority or disobedience.
Mm-hmm. Is there any prospect of bringing these two approaches into combination, into connection with each other?
Well, I'm trying. I've just finished a book with Cambridge University Press, actually, on this, where I combine the two. It's not published yet. It's going to be released in a few months, I think. But I think it's very important to contrast what they say and what their brain says. If I quote.
And what are you going to say about that? What have you said about that?
So maybe we could have the next year session on your book.
Okay, all right.
We can do that.
It would be very interesting. So,
Thank you.
So no, I think it was Dan's turn to.
Dan or Paul?
How do you prefer?
Doesn't matter to me. I'll go ahead. So I've been trimming and trimming in order to make my comments shorter and shorter. Point number one is, Matt, that I really enjoyed reading this book and struggling with this book. It's fascinating on the topic of Milgram, and the approach that you and Jason take to Milgram is a really interesting one. But it's also important for the reasons we've been talking about now for 2.5 hours. Two reasons, really. First of all, it addresses a profoundly difficult moral question. Why do ordinary people do atrocious things to other human beings? Many of us have mentioned Christopher Browning in Ordinary Men, Jan Gross's book about the massacre of Jewish residents of the village by their Christian neighbors in Neighbors, and the experience of the Khmer Rouge in Rwanda, which have been brought up today as well. But there are lots of other examples, lots of other horrendous and horrible examples. The My Lai massacre by American troops of villagers in Vietnam, the family separation policy during the Trump administration, the Russian atrocities which have been documented at Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine, and going back to World War II, I.G. Farben's corporate complicity in Auschwitz, in forced labor, in the production of deadly gas for gas chambers. And so the question, what motivates and differentiates genociders, bystanders, and rescuers? That is a hugely important question. But this book tries to go even beyond that. It goes to the problem of empirical moral psychology. How should we approach moral behavior from an empirical point of view? Is there an empirical science of morality? And what is distinctive about this book is that it looks for morality in social interactions almost exclusively. Social interactions are the heart of moral behavior, according to this book. Key to their argument, and evidently the driving force, is their interest in Milgram. But this is a general question about lived morality or everyday morality. However, as sympathetic as I am to the importance of the problems, I find that the interactionist approach is not convincing as a general framework for thinking about social morality. It is not a good general solution to the problem of an empirical science of moral thinking. It is part of such a science, but only a part, and frankly, I would say a relatively small part. The deliberate neglect of the thinking and deliberating actor is debilitating. And this is, perfectly clear in the ethnomethodology literature, as well as in the book, that the thinking, deliberating actor is put aside or minimized. The book deliberately refrains from trying to shed light on the actual thought processes and reasoning of the participants. Milgram didn't try to do that, and this book doesn't try to do it either in the Milgram experiment. In my view, it is preferable to look at interactionism as a method, a technique of investigation, rather than as a full and substantive theory of moral psychology. It is a method of inquiry, but not a theory of the substantive underlying cognitive, practical processes guiding the individual's actions. So here are four specific concerns, three on the general question of empirical psychology and one on the findings about Milgram. First, Hollander and Turowetz give insufficient attention to the prior action frameworks, the cognitive frameworks, the mental frameworks of the individuals. But the prior mental world of the subject is in general hugely relevant. I want to take that view anyway, is hugely relevant to their behavior in difficult moral situations. So that's comment number one. Need to pay real substantive attention to the action framework, the mental framework of the individuals. Number two, the authors emphasize the fluid nature of self-image and identity. This is how they motivate the idea that interaction is at the core of moral behavior, that there is a kind of fluid self-definition which occurs through interaction. But this kind of micro interaction is actually a rare part of moral behavior. It's one part of moral behavior, but only one part. And so there's a risk of overgeneralizing, I think, that comes out in the book. Number three, how well does this formulation work for other situations of difficult choices for ordinary moral people? And I tried to think of some very mundane examples. Giving to a homeless person as you walk down the street in Ann Arbor, Michigan, making eye contact with a stranger in the streets of Brooklyn, speaking one's true opinion in a politically charged school board meeting. In none of those cases is the interactive part of it especially important to the moral outcomes. In these ordinary circumstances, interaction is not key, in my opinion. Rather, antecedent moral emotions and convictions and identities are operative. So there may be a felt obligation of caring concern for the anonymous other, a feeling of pity. I think Karsten's work on empathy and pity is so important. There may be a duty, an experienced duty. This is the kind of person I am. I'm a person who stands up for what I believe in. A desire to recognize the human reality of the other, not as a moral principle learned from Kant, but as a practical moral intuition and practical impulse in the decision maker. The last little bit of psychology that I introduced to myself was embarrassment about insincere silence. We're involved in a conversation and we just don't speak up, even though some horrible things have been said. Well, one reason for that may be that we're embarrassed, and then we're embarrassed at our silence. And then finally, a comment about the interpretation of, this is not final, I have two other points I want to make, but in terms of specific comments about the book, did the teachers accept the premise of the experiment? This is a little paradoxical in the findings of the book, because their ultimate finding is there's no question of obedience here, because the teachers actually didn't ever believe that real pain was being induced. That they did not believe the premise of the setup. Instead, but what I want to put forward is that the teachers did in fact take the experimental subjects, did take the pleas and screams of the learners seriously. They felt pity for the learners. They were increasingly led to resistance to the demands of the experimenter. And by the way, one of the things I really admire about the book is the nuanced view that it now offers of resistance and phases and stages and different forms of resistance. I think that's a really important contribution of the book. I'd like to draw a contrast in the last couple of minutes. Some research and a book which I find very interesting is by Kristen Monroe, who has done extensive analysis, in some ways kind of similar analysis, except that it doesn't emphasize the ethno-methodological part of it. She's done extensive analysis of interviews of genociders, bystanders, and rescuers during the Holocaust. She's made a very careful attempt to code those interviews and to discover what the underlying mental processes are, which seem to distinguish the three categories of genociders, bystanders, and rescuers. And here is one of her conclusions. Our analysis suggests that if we can understand how people see the world and themselves in relation to others, that is the kind of moral worldview which a person brings to the situation, if we can decipher their cognitive frameworks, perceptions, and categorization schemes, we may begin to determine why identity exerts such a powerful influence on our treatment of others. What I find very powerful about this is that she's doing empirical research, but she's also supporting a view which says that moral identity, moral kind of framework, moral antecedent assumptions about the world and about how to view other people, that this is a crucial part of the process leading to either being a bystander, being a genocider, or being a rescuer. More generally, the approach I find most convincing in the approach to moral psychology is one that begins with a rich conception of the human moral subject, historically situated and culturally situated. I absolutely agree with the comments that were made about cultural difference and the different frameworks that we may find in different cultural and historical settings, but that those framework kind of identities are crucially important. The person is possessed with a social identity and self-image. The person is situated within a set of meaningful social relationships, and the person embodies a range of moral emotions. We need to have some richness to the conception of the moral actor if we are to make sense of these difficult moral situations of participants, bystanders, and rescuers. With a rich conception underlying the research agenda, then we can do empirical study of the causal and meaning-laden processes that influence action in these terrible and difficult circumstances. The person whose work I admire the most in the field of moral philosophy at the moment is Martha Nussbaum, and her work on compassion, her effort to try to make sense of the behavior of individuals in morally challenging circumstances, sometimes in interaction, and sometimes as a result of deliberation and thought and an emotional reaction to a situation. And she makes a very strong case for thinking that we need to take seriously the cognitive moral frameworks of ordinary human beings when we investigate moral behavior in concrete circumstances of choice. So that just shoots right through the comments which I have. And I hope that, Matt, I hope you understand that these are friendly comments, even though I ultimately argue that interactionism doesn't really suffice as a theory of moral psychology generally. Nonetheless, I have great respect for the work that you and Jason have done, and I find the work to be a very important contribution. So thanks.
Yeah, and thanks so much. And I won't attempt to respond to the various points that you make. Very, very important points. Thanks so much for your thoughtful presentation of those points. And I would definitely like to continue to consider each of those points very carefully. Thanks so much.
Paul? Sound is up. Oh, yeah. That's good.
Did I go?
Yes.
Raphael?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So I realize I want to frame my comments, and I'm not sure how either frame will work. One relies on an American idiom where we can speak of people who see a glass half empty as opposed to seeing it half full. I don't know how well that idiom travels, right? It's the difference between taking an optimistic view of what you see as opposed to a pessimistic view without disputing how much is in the glass.
Have the same.
And so I'm going to offer a reading of what Matt and Jason have done that's very much on the half empty side, where I think Matt and Dan and Karsten are very much half full people. The second one is and in this, again, there's a famous essay, well, two famous essays, both with the same title, Moral Luck. The one I have in mind is Thomas Nagel's essay, where briefly the idea is that moral evaluation turns to a surprising and an unacknowledged extent on sheer contingencies. We like to think of morality as something agental, something we use to evaluate individuals or acts. And in far too many situations, it's not at all about choice. It's about contingencies, accidents of birth, accidents of culture, accidents of situations. And just to put my cards fully on the table, I'm going to wind up claiming we should be as surprised that the moral order is maintained as opposed to the so-called moral order is maintained as opposed to cases where it's falling apart. People are treating the cases where the Holocaust cases as near incomprehensible exceptions. I want to suggest we could be as amazed, or maybe we should be more amazed than we are, that the moral order perpetuates itself. That that incidents like we find in extreme, like the Holocaust, could easily be the norm under sort of moral luck type of scenarios. But let me go a little bit more into specifics, and I'll try and rush through things because, like Dan, a lot of these points have been made, and I don't want to belabor what's already been discussed. So anyway, Jason and Matt focus on how situation comes to be defined as moral situations, right? And lots already been said about what makes a situation moral. But here's what they say. We argue that identities and situations achieve their moral character in interaction. The interaction and its constitutive requirements for making self and meaning come first and must be the primary unit of analysis, right? That's up front in their book. I want to suggest to Matt that I don't see that you maintain that focus as consistently as you claim. That is, in some cases, I think you revert to predefining the situations as moral, as opposed to actually observing empirically how the definition emerges from interactions. So the constituting of moral meaning in terms of interactions, as opposed to predetermined features or principles, is, I take it, your primary focus. Again, quoting, you say, in particular, close analysis of the experiment showed precisely how a situation may come to have moral implications in the first place, and how those implications arise within the structure of interactions, and how outcomes depend on whether participants explicitly treat them as moral problems. So I'll cut my quote short here. This is from page 35. But at any rate, my comment here is this. But this, of course, gives rise to the suggestion that the concern is anything at all to do with moral principles, for it appears that a principled moral assessment of situation is precisely what they wish to avoid. There would, in short, appear to be no intrinsically moral situations, right? It arises from the interaction or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it seems by definition, you call it constitutive, by definition, it's not a moral situation. End of story. So I don't understand from, and I'm actually sympathetic to this. So, but I just find you ambivalent about it. It says, I have trouble making sense of how you ask from the question whether any particular situation is specifically a moral one, if the question doesn't arise for the participants. And put another way, I do not see here a space for saying that participants misread a situation, that they ought to have seen it as moral, but they didn't, right? That would be to take precisely the perspective you appear to be disavowing. So I want to know what the space here is for participants, quote unquote, misreading a situation. It seems impossible under your theoretical setup, and yet I find you talking fairly regularly in the book as if they ought to have read it in a certain way, or they failed in some sense to read it appropriately. Now, philosophers classify terms such as moral as normative, meaning that it expresses a sense of an assessment in the dimension where one can speak of rightness and wrongness, correctness or incorrectness. But the normative, and I think Karsten brought up this point, but I'm going to make slightly different use of it. Right? The normative notion of normativity is much broader than normally speaking, than the notion of morality. Right? We can speak of normative assessment of games, whether they're done skillfully or not, or whether they made the right move, and this, except in some sense that almost trivializes the notion of moral. you can't speak of these as moral situations. And so I see you're having a concern with normativity. I don't understand yet how you understand what makes a situation specifically moral as opposed to generically normative, right? And this comes out, you know, I actually, you cite two of my favorite social theorists, Garfinkel and Goffman, but I think Goffman's much harder nosed in this respect. Garfinkel speaks of trust conditions, which is, of course, already normatively freighted, whereas Goffman just speaks of working consensus, right, which is much more situational and just, you know, doesn't have the overt normative connotations that the notion of trust does. So yeah, I was really struck. One of the examples you use that I wasn't aware of, but the Garfinkel case where the supposed psychotherapist gives random answers and people impose an order on that. And again, this is very reminiscent of a very famous essay by Stanley Fish called "Is There a Text in This Class?" I don't know if you're familiar with that, Matt, where Fish, famous postmodern theorist, right, gives the example. Steve's smiling, he clearly knows this. He leaves on the board a random from a previous class, a random collection of terms. And when the new class comes in, he says, "This is a poem, you need to give me an interpretation." And sure enough, these clever graduate students, in fairly short order, whip up all sorts of wonderful interpretations of these collections but right, what's the point? The point, I take it, is, and this is where I'm really going to press you on, the ability, the seeming ability of humans to impose order where there just isn't one, or right, to not kind of accept, you know, randomness or anything, that we impose order and it doesn't take much to prompt people to do that. And you know, Dan was just commenting on the culture. I'm less interested in that, and from a Goffman-esque standpoint, more interested in structural, sort of quasi-Weberian constraints of power, right? Because a big difference, it seems to me, between Garfinkel and Goffman is Goffman is often looking, or typically looking, it seems to me, at how people struggle to maintain identity against erasure, where that's not really, as I read Garfinkel, his primary concern. And right, it seems to me a point, I'm throwing out some random points here, but you completely overlook, and I'm afraid I'm going to press Dan on this tomorrow. You completely overlook the other ways in which conformity can be constructed. And so the reference in here again is there's a popular book, or Freakonomics, right, that looks at how social orders in groups get structured, you know, sort of in an invisible hand type of way. You know, what we would call a thin notion of rationality, where you know, Dan has just been emphasizing a very thick the importance of a very thick notion of rationality, right, in the classic Goethean sense. So another question or problem I have with your work is you seem to just ignore how thin rationality could account for the results that you're interested in, rather than, flailing about and trying to find specific cognitive mechanisms. Let me see here. So a related tension is, you write, this is at one point you write on 48, actors have a moral obligation to make sense and self together, an obligation that is moral because sense and self are moral goods and cannot exist without it. And then you say, which requires, your word requires orienting to the same constitutive practices and expectations of others and holding myself accountable. But then a page later, here's what you write. This is on 49. You write, alternatively, they, that is the actors, may treat the trouble as an ordinary problem rather than as a moral one, and attempt to continue the interaction without explicitly acknowledging any threat to self and sense making, or they may even deny that there's a threat to sense at all. So in one case you say the situation requires that they do this, in the other you say right within a page, maybe yes, maybe no. And then you go on to cite, just to be fair to you, you say, well, if we look at Goffman and Hegel, we can see the pressures here. But when you actually chase down that reference, what you're talking about is Goffman on secondary adjustments. And frankly, I don't see how that makes the case for a requirement. And I'm afraid the Hegelian pressure here is just lost on me. And let me just make, just to keep within some bounds here, you're doing being ordinary. I wasn't familiar with that phrase. It's a great phrase. And here, I really want to talk about the limits of interpretation in your book. You claim at the end, and I think you're just wrong about this, that the reason the Milgram work doesn't really bear on the Holocaust interpretation is that the interpretive frame is, so to speak, going to break at some point, that it can't be sustained. I mean, I have quotes here. And I just don't see that you provide any evidence at all for that. You do document, of course, the tensions and the resistance. But if we look at some actual cases, I'm thinking here, the Klemperer diaries, I Will Bear Witness, where what he documents, what he bears witness to is, Klemperer was a fully assimilated German Jew. He Iron Cross winner for World War I, married to a Christian woman. And when the Nuremberg laws went into effect, he was just stripped of everything. His academic position, his property, his neighbors turned on him virtually overnight, right? And it's not, and the second case is a famous controversy that postdated the Historica strike, but was in the same, between the historian Saul Friedlander and Martin Brozat, where Brozat, right, no hint of anti-Semitism or anything on the part of Brozat work, but he looked at how ordinary Germans in small villages reacted to what was going on in the Second World War. And his claim was they didn't see much difference in ordinary life, right? At least in the early stages of the war. And Friedlander intervenes in this and says, their neighbors are disappearing. They're just vanishing, right? And he says, and Brozat reports, people didn't see anything particularly out of the ordinary. And I think what the Klemperer cases and the Friedman-Brozak case point to is the ability of people to do the ordinary, even in the face of what appears quite extraordinary. Your neighbors are just vanishing, right? Well, who knows? So it seems to me that the actual cases speak strongly against your rather half full interpretation that the Milgram perspective would not be maintained under real world pressures, that when people are faced with situations where extraordinary things, very out of the ordinary things are happening to their neighbors or to their colleagues, they are rationalized. And that for better or worse, Milgram gives us an enduring paradigm, no matter what people say in these when looked at in a fine-grained way, no matter what they say, at the end of the day, you're going to robustly have a lot of people who just continue doing the ordinary in these situations. I'm sorry, I've been throwing a lot. I hope it's been relatively coherent. Thank you.
And Paul, I'd like to thank you very much. Just as with Dan's comments, these are comments I'm not going to try to respond to each one after the other, but I recognize the importance and the seriousness of these comments. I'd really like to continue to think about them. Thank you.
So yeah, I just wanted to have a follow-up on Paul's comments, because so I had the same impression that actually your book gives the conclusion of your book that we cannot apply Milgram to Browning or to the Holocaust. I was really dissatisfied with it because I had the impression it was the opposite. But I think the problem lies with the definition of morality that you use. That's why I think it's a very crucial point, because if we use morality in the terms of good and evil, then we cannot say that there was a morality in what Nazi did. But if we take morality in the sense of norms that are behind a practice, then there was an ideology, there was a morality in this sense. So, for instance, the historian Claudia Kunz, she speaks about the Nazi conscience. So it's the idea that it's a moral conscience. And so then if we use morality in this deflationary sense that is relativistic, that you have a morality of Nazi, a morality of cannibals, a morality of, so then we could really apply your framework, because we could say that the people in Josepho that are described by Browning, so they were also trying to make sense of to save the sense of the situation that was given by Trapp, that Jews were colluding to do evil things to Germany, and also to save themselves. So themselves are German men trying to save the country against these threats of Jews. So you could really have apply your framework to this case study of Browning, and then your typology of the 6 kind of resistance really apply to Browning's case, because what Browning shows that people resisted in subtle ways. They didn't take the gun and shot everyone around them or their commander, but they really hesitated. They try to shoot in the other way, that they hid. So there are also all these ways of subtle resistance. It's not like heroic resistance or Hollywoodian resistance, but they resisted. And I think your approach is very, very interesting to make sense of Browning's case. So I would say against yourself that your book is much more has much more power to illuminate historical case than you seem to imply.
Raphael, thanks so much. Yeah, as with the previous comments, I'd really like to consider these. And I guess overall in the comments, I think one thing that I'm sort of thinking about and realizing is how much there is to know. And it reminds me again of the interdisciplinary nature of what we're doing right here. There is so much specialized knowledge that is represented in this chat room. And from neuroscience to philosophy to the history of the Holocaust, one thing that I'm really realizing is some of the major limitations of my own background and knowledge in some of these major areas.
Yeah, I had another follow-up on Dan and also Paul's comments. It was about the cognitivist, as the fact that you don't want to go into cognition. And then when you analyze this way of going on with the analysis, with the experiments, that consists in saying that the person was not, that the learner was overreacting, and that's actually his screams were, or he was not suffering so much, and so they really. So I think that there your analysis really falls into Festinger's framework of cognitive dissonance, and that's then you're not talking anymore about a moral dilemma, but rather about a cognitive dilemma of who to trust. It's not anymore moral; it's more cognition. And okay, you can say hello to my girl. I will have to move in my office. So yeah, that's why these were my two questions. Mm-hmm. This was my second. Sorry, my second. Yeah, I really think that's so. First, you should use Festinger, and second, then it's not anymore a moral dilemma; it's more a cognitive dilemma of who to trust. So it's not on the same level. But I will move to my office.
Yeah, well, I maybe to sort of sum up, I'm not sure, Raphael, are we nearing conclusion?
Also, maybe if there, I can know I am almost in safety, so we could, if there are questions, maybe if you want to answer, or if there are other questions, it just depends on what's going on.
Matt, can I just put, I realize I threw a lot of points at you, but I would like to hear more about this point I tried to raise about the possibility of misreading a situation on your interactionist perspective. If the morality really arises out of sort of mutual interpretation, and the mutual interpretation doesn't see it as there, it can an observer say they misread the situation, or are you just left to say, well, yeah, this wasn't a moral situation, people were disappearing, people were bad things were, from another perspective we say no, bad things were happening, but since the participants didn't see it that way, there's nothing morally we can say.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And maybe I can just preface my comment by saying I don't have a well-worked answer on this topic. My thinking, as with many of these issues, is coming from Ann Rawls, who's a current contemporary important theorist in the interaction order tradition, coming out of Goffman and Garfinkel, and ultimately from Durkheim. Anne has a book from 2005, I believe, which starts to introduce an argument about the universality of certain moral norms. And her argument is that she is grounding certain basic moral values, for example, equality and reciprocity, in the interaction order. She's claiming that despite what participants in any given interaction may do, the morality of what they're doing can be judged against something which is transcending or beyond that particular interaction, and also oriented to in any given interaction by participants' orientation to basic norms of reciprocity and equality. That is an argument that I would need to review in a lot more detail, I think, in order to respond adequately to your question. And so I think, again, I'm sort of coming up against the limits of my own knowledge, not only of Anne's work, but also of moral philosophy, contemporary moral philosophy in general.
Well, just one final twist, and it's more of just, an invitation, as you frame your response, right? It's not just, philosophy, but the Garfinkel and the Fish cases were meant to say to you, look, the ability of people to find order or whatever, and so yeah, you waver, understandably, but you waver between wanting to say there's something intrinsic to the situation which the participants ought to be responding to, and saying, wow, look at how good we are at just interpreting things any which way, and those pull against each other, I think, in a very important way, not just philosophically, but for your own, your own intuitions seem to be in conflict, right? You don't want to go full postmodern, it seems, but at the same time, you at least some points in the book disavow wanting to pre-interpret what a situation contains or holds, and I think you need to resolve that in your own mind as you go forward.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments. Thank you very much.
So I don't know if there are further questions or no.
Okay, well, just to perhaps close things up, thank you so much to everyone. This was a very rich conversation from a number of different points of view. And as I've mentioned before, I think one of the aspects of this richness, and also one of the challenges for me as an author, is absorbing all this richness because of the wealth of disciplinary backgrounds that everyone is representing. I think it's been an ambitious book. We have attempted to make connections between our background in a particular area of sociology and social science and interaction order sociology, and make connections with the sociology of morality, with the Milgram paradigm literature, touching on issues relevant to Milgram and morality that are also important to some kinds of historians, philosophers, neuroscientists, etc. And that's a challenge. I think we can all readily see that it's difficult to do well all those different aspects. I think most valuable to me are some of the comments that have to do about internal inconsistencies in the book. And again, I don't have ready answers for those, but I would definitely like to continue to take those seriously and to think about them. I'm very happy that I believe this conversation is being video recorded. I'd like to study the video recording in the future. I'd also like to send this to my co-author, Jason Turowetz, so that we can continue to discuss this conversation. So thanks to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. You will make an ethno-methodological study, conversational analysis of the video, maybe.
So Raphael, we're meeting again tomorrow at 8?
Yes, we meet tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.